reflecting on the role of Teshuvah in this period of the year during the month of Elul, Chazal often focus on the acronym of Elul Anila Dodi V'Dodi Li. They see it as an immense opportunity to build our relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam. It's important to reflect on a certain enigma when it comes to Hilchos Teshuvah. On the one hand, the theme of Teshuvah is a theme that is ubiquitous and that applies all year round. Actually, the Marsha at the end of Masechet Megillah explains that we don't have a parallel to Vaydaber Moshe Moadei Yisrael Moadei Hashem Bnei Yisrael, because Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur represent the theme of Teshuvah, and the theme of Teshuvah is something that applies all year round. The Rambam, when he talks about Hilchos Teshuvah, in the very beginning, zeroes in on the obligation to do Teshuvah every day, to respond to any transgression, any act of rebellion, to neutralize that, to perform the mitzvah of Teshuvah. It's clear that the obligation is a daily and constant obligation. The same is true with regard to the Sefer HaChinuch, with regard to the Ramban. The Ramban explains that the pasuk in Devarim, Ki HaMitzvah Hazos, where the Torah goes on to describe Lo Rechoka Hi, Lo B'Shamayim Hi, Lo Me'ever Layam. According to the Ramban, that is a reference to the mitzvah of Teshuvah, and it's a mitzvah, Beficha Uvavcha La'asoso, that applies all year round. And yet there are indications that the month of Elul, and especially the Yom Noraim, and the Tkufa that is called Aseres Yemei Teshuvah, are not only conducive for Teshuvah, but that there is an additional dimension or obligation as well. The Sefer HaChinuch, when he talks about the mitzvah of Teshuvah, concludes that if a person abstains from doing Teshuvah on Yom Kippur specifically, that constitutes a bittul aseh of the mitzvah of Teshuvah. In other words, while the obligation exists all year round in a proactive way, the impact of not capitalizing on that opportunity, that impact is reserved for Yom Kippur specifically. The Rambam, when he talks about Teshuvah, always talks about the mitzvah of vidui. This is a point of controversy in the Rambam that attracted all of the Mefarshim. But if you look at Perek Aleph of Hilchos Teshuvah and the Koteret and Sefer Mitzvos, the Rambam never speaks about the obligation to do Teshuvah. He always speaks about when one does Teshuvah, the obligation to do vidui. However, in Perek Beis of Hilchos Teshuvah, Halacha Zayin, the Rambam says that Yom Kippur, Huzman Teshuvah l'kol yachid ol rabim, hu keit slichom mechila liYisrael, lefikach chayavim hakol lasos Teshuvah u'leisvados b'Yom Kippurim. It's the only time in the 10 chapters of Hilchos Teshuvah that the Rambam speaks about an obligation to do Teshuvah. And Rabbeinu Yonah, in his famous essay, Sharei Teshuvah, where he encapsulates all of Hilchos Teshuvah, suggests that really there are two mitzvahs of Teshuvah, a mitzvah of Kol HaShana and a specific mitzvah on Yom Kippur, based on his reading of the pasuk in Achrei Mos, Ki b'yom hazeh yichaper aleichem, l'taher eschem mikol chatoseichem, lifnei Hashem titaru. Rabbeinu Yonah renders lifnei Hashem titaru not as a haftacha, that a promise that one's tshuva will be accepted, but as an imperative, lifnei Hashem titaru, that on this day one be motivated to capitalize on the opportunity and to do tshuva. So on the one hand, tshuva applies all year round, and logically it must apply all year round, because being in a state of mered, of rebellion, by doing an aveira and ignoring it, is certainly completely unacceptable. The opportunity and the obligation of tshuva has to be ubiquitous and constant. And yet there seems to be an added dimension on Yom Kippur, and the question is, what exactly is that? In order to explain it, I thought I would just take 1 minute to speak about a pasuk in the parsha that we just read in Parshas Kisavo. In Parshas Kisavo, the Torah enumerates the various klalos and brachos, but especially the klalos, that were articulated on Har Grizim and Har Eval. And after enumerating numerous very serious infractions that are subject to klala, the Torah concludes by saying, Arur asher leyakim es kol divrei HaTorah hazos. Rashi explains that in addition to the specific infractions that are identified in the Torah, there's a broader concluding infraction that Arur asher leyakim, whoever doesn't fulfill, kol Torah kula. And the question that Mefarshim ask is, Mimon Shach, if you have specific klalos, then why do you need a separate klala for anyone who violates anything in Kol Torah Kula? What is the relationship between these two presentations? The Ramban goes further and suggests that Arur asher leyakim doesn't mean yikayim, to fulfill, it means to affirm. And that what this pasuk is referring to is the obligation to promulgate and to reinforce our commitment to Kol Torah Kula, which of course is connected to, but also transcends fulfilling every one of the mitzvos and avoiding every one of the averos, but requires that we affirm them and commit to the totality of the system as well. In other words, there is much evidence that in addition to the obligation to fulfill individual mitzvos and avoid specific averos, that there's another more holistic, more aspirational, demanding obligation, and that is the commitment to Kol Torah Kula as a system, as a value system, as a way of life, as a guide in one's life. And essentially, we have this in the Aseres HaDibros as well. According to many Rishonim, the Aseres HaDibros encapsulates all of Taryag mitzvos. Why do we need each mitzvah separately and the Aseres HaDibros to encapsulate all of them? Why do we need Sefer Devarim, Mishnah Torah, which integrates and reviews many aspects of Torah that we've previously learned? Why do we need a separate Sefer dedicated to that? But the answer is that there is, of course, a primary focus on each individual opportunity and hazard in terms of mitzvos and averos. But in addition, there is the holistic perspective of embracing the totality of the system and making one's life dependent upon and determined by a proactive affirmation of Kol Torah Kula. And this is what the Teshuvah of Chodesh Elul and Aseres Yemei Teshuvah, and especially Yom Kippur, is about as well. All year round, there's an obligation of Teshuvah to neutralize Averos and to respond to them, not to be Omed B'mered. But on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, even earlier, and Elul, as we contemplate this period, as we know that our lives are in the balance and they're being judged and assessed, it's also a time to recommit holistically to the totality of Torah and to the principles that guide our behavior. Beyond specific, scrupulous attention to mitzvos and averos, this broader commitment in its own right is even more aspirational and ambitious. And therefore, specifically because it's not the moment when we violated, but it's the moment when we assess our future and our purpose and our direction, there is an obligation proactively to do tshuva. And that obligation, of course, includes neutralizing averos, or the non-capitalizing, capitalizing on mitzvos, but it goes beyond to the commitment itself. Arur asher leyakim, in the Ramban and Rashi sense of Kol Torah Kula. And therefore, according to Rabbeinu Yonah, there's a separate mitzvah saseh of doing tshuva on Yom Kippur, as we noted, based on the imperative of Ki bayom hazeh yichaper aleichem b'tareschem mikol chatosechem lifnei Hashem titaru. The language of tahara implies this holistic tshuva. According to the Chinuch, the bitul aseh only applies on Yom Kippur because that's where all of tshuva as a holistic concept emerges. And according to the Rambam, while normally the obligation is vidui in the context of tshuva, the proactive assessment of one's spiritual stature and status requires a chiyuv tshuva, specifically on Yom Kippur. And that's why we consider Elul to be the time of ani l'dodi v'dodi li. We reassess our relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom. And of course, we say l'david Hashem ori, in which we express Achas shalti meis Hashem osa vakesh, shivti beveis Hashem kol yimei chayai, lachzos benoam Hashem ulevaker behechalom. Because we're being holistic and proactive, not only in avoiding errors and prohibitions, but in refining our purpose and our goals. And I think this theme particularly resonates in the educational philosophy of our yeshiva, where a holistic approach and the effort to integrate and to interconnect the different aspects of Avodas Hashem is really a hallmark of our commitment to Torah and to mitzvos. I want to wish everybody a ksiva v'chasima tova and a shnas chaim v'shalom. May we succeed not only in neutralizing individual averos and recommitting to the performance of specific mitzvos, but even the bigger ideal of Teshuvah on Yom Kippur, of Shivti B'Veis Hashem, Kol Yemei Chayai, the concept of Ani L'Dodi V'Dodi Li.